I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about a 3rd century A.D. philosopher by the name of Plotinus. Plotinus is important to Christian theology and Christian philosophy because of his great influence on Augustine. St. Augustine, who lived in the 4th century, was deeply influenced by Plotinus and some of his followers and thinkers associated with him. Plotinus nowadays is considered to be the greatest of the thinkers that we identify as Neoplatonists, the Neoplatonists. Plato, of course, the great 4th century B.C. philosopher, his writings were sort of, in a way, deepened, his insights were deepened and sort of systematized into a new approach that had some new characteristics, that there was some blending together of some ideas and some advancement of Plato's thought that nowadays we call Neoplatonism. Now, of course, it wasn't known as Neoplatonism back in its time. It was simply known as Platonism, that it was people who operated in the school of thought identified with Plato. Now, I want to identify a couple of features of Plotinus's thought that will be especially important for us when we get to talking about people like Augustine, who will be our next thinker that we'll consider for a little while. But with Plotinus, let me just say a few things about him. First of all, he was, like I say, a 3rd century A.D. thinker, which means that he lived in the same time period in which Christianity is developing. Christianity is still illegal formally in the Roman Empire during the life of Plotinus. Plotinus himself was not a Christian. There are some indications that he was aware of Christianity, that he found Christianity problematic because of its emphasis on faith. Plotinus wanted a philosophy, a religious philosophy, that was grounded in reason. He was a man of reason, but he was also a deeply religious man. Plotinus was, by all accounts, something of a mystic. He very much on an experiential level encountered his philosophical ideas, or I should say they grew out of his experience as a thinker, as a person of deep introspection. As I've mentioned several times before, Plato is a very interior type of guy. He turns inward and he studies the soul. He studies the mind and its activities. Well, Plotinus is very much like that as well. He's a man of deep interiority, and he was known as a person who would fall into trance-like states of mind, and his followers, of course, when he would come out of those states, he would speak about his philosophical ideas, and they were very much sort of associated with these kinds of experiences that he had. Now, let me try to give you just a quick suggestion of ideas connected to Plotinus. First of all, Plotinus and his associates very much noticed the tendency of the human mind to search for unity. We search for ways of unifying the experience that we have of the world. For example, if we were sitting in a classroom or a room or a building full of human beings, and someone were to say, look out across this building, what do you see? We would probably say, well, I see human beings. I see humans. What has the mind done? When I say I see human beings, I have identified something that all of those individual objects in the room that I'm looking at have in common. There's something that they all share. There's a higher reality that all of them are in some way or another embodiments of. They are all embodiments of humanness or being human. So what the mind has done is it's moved up from these many different individuals to a general insight or a general universal insight into what they are. If we didn't have that ability to move above the individual, then there would be no such thing as science. Science, of course, is very much based on generalizing about the way the world works around us, based on the conviction that all these things that we're experiencing around us are just particular individual embodiments or instantiations of general principles or ideas. I just got off an airplane yesterday, and I was doing a lot of flying here in the last couple of weeks to a couple of different places. And so airplanes are astonishing to me because of, first of all, the fact that we're able to get from one location to another in a fraction of the time that it's taken most people through the course of human history. A trip, like to fly from here to Detroit. I flew there the other day, and to fly from here to Detroit in 2 hours and 4 minutes. It took almost 3 hours to get back. We were moving against the jet stream, but on the way it took 2 hours to get to Detroit. It would take me, of course, much, much longer to drive. It would take much, much longer to ride a horse or to walk. The ways or the means that were available to people down through the centuries were able to move across the world in a day, to get to the other side of the planet in a day, when, of course, through history it would take enormous sums of time and energy and difficulty to get there. All of this is based on a knowledge of how the world works so that we can then create machines like an aircraft, an airplane, that can take us through air at high rates of speed. All of that involves a knowledge of how the world works and a conviction that these general principles apply to the world that we're experiencing around us. And so that generalization, that ability to know how the world works, allows someone to build an aircraft or to imagine one, and then to put one together, and then to put another one together, and to know that the second one is going to operate like the first one, because the principles of the general principles apply to all the specific cases of something. So what has the mind done? It's moved up to a general knowledge of air, about motion, about wings and speed, and all of these things. Those general insights allow us to put together something that works in this world. Now, what Plato notices or Plotinus rather, what he notices is that the mind has a tendency to keep doing this, and it moves up higher and higher to different levels of insight into the world. Like, for example, we have, you've probably seen charts, in textbooks and things on science, say a biology textbook that takes all the different kinds of mammals, let's say, or all the different kinds of plants, and it categorizes them and puts them under a broader genus. So you have different species or different types of things underneath a broader genus. Imagine those genus and species charts going up higher and higher. What's the highest generalization that we can make about the world? For example, what do plants and animals have in common? Well, we could say they're both living things, so we could have a category of living things. What do living things and non-living things have in common? You could say they're both material things, or they're both beings. They both have perhaps atomic structure or molecular structure or whatever the right categories are. We can keep coming up with higher and higher generalizations. Well, what's the highest generalization we can have? What does the mind reach to when it reaches the limits of its ability to unify reality around us? Well, Plotinus thinks what the mind gets to at the highest level is a notion, an all-encompassing notion of being, of reality. But for Plotinus, in order for that thought or that knowledge of unity to reach its highest point, its most supreme point, the mind itself must give up all distinction or all separation, and therefore the mind itself must become one with what it knows. That's where the mystical dimension of his thought comes in. Is that, and I know I'm moving fast with this, it's a difficult thought for many, especially if you're not used to thinking like this, but just imagine it like this. The mind has moved upward to higher and higher levels of unified knowledge. And imagine that when you get to the very top of what the human mind can do, imagine that the mind itself becomes one with no separation of thought and the person. Like I'm right now thinking about these things, but there's a difference between me, my thought, and that about which I'm thinking. But what if all those distinctions dissolved and went away? Then what you would have is me and my thought becoming one with the reality that I'm thinking about. And so at the end of the process of discovering the unity of all things, I become united with everything. I become one with all the rest of reality that I have discovered its ultimate internal, intrinsic oneness. So this is a kind of mysticism, almost a pantheistic mysticism, or an Eastern type of mysticism, where there's a state of mind that we can get to in which we become one with all of reality, that we become one with everything that we think, and that all thought dissolves into union with all of reality. And at that point, Plotinus thinks, we have touched the core and center of all reality, which he calls the One. The center of everything, the source of everything, is the One. But we can't rationally talk about the One beyond what I've already said. We can't really talk about it because the One because it transcends all thought, because thought involves separation and division and distinction into all these different subcategories. Once we get to the One, to truly know the One is to be the One, to be dissolved into the One, to become the One. And so this is a kind of mysticism of union, of ultimate oneness and dissolving of ourselves into that supreme reality, that supreme One. This way of thinking for Plotinus is going to be enormously significant in the mind of Augustine. And there's a number of reasons why. And Augustine's obviously not going to accept all of Plotinus' thought. But there are some uncanny similarities between the mysticism of Plotinus and the philosophy of Plotinus and Christian theology. For example, just to identify a couple of them, for Plotinus, our whole life is a quest for union with that ultimate source of oneness of all things and the source of everything. Our whole life is a journey to that One. Well, obviously in Christian theology, life is a journey as well. We're journeying through the intellect and through the will to try to find our way home to the supreme reality. If you look at St. Augustine's book, The Confessions, on the very first page, there's the famous line where Augustine says, "O Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." This is that idea that life is a journey toward union and rest with the supreme reality. So there's obviously some parallels between the One and what we call God as the supreme source and ground of everything else. So there are these similarities, but there are also important differences between Christian theology and what we find here in Plotinus' philosophy. For example, Plotinus tends to think about this whole journey as really an intellectual journey, whereas for Christian theology, this whole process is ultimately one of the heart. It includes the mind, of course, but it's a journey of love, and it's a journey of love that requires the movement of the will. And the movement of the will, we believe in Christian theology, is hindered by the reality of sin. Sin keeps us from completing that journey to the One, or to God. And so in Christian theology, this whole story is mixed up with the drama of sinfulness and of forgetfulness of God. And therefore, in Christian faith, God comes to meet us. The One, the supreme reality that is the source of everything, comes to us because He cares for us, loves us. He comes to us in our changingness, in our frailty, and He shows us the way home to Himself, to the One. God shows us the realities that we could not know apart from Him revealing Himself. In Plotinus' thought, there's a kind of basic agnosticism. We cannot know the One outside of becoming one with the One. In Christian theology, there's also a kind of agnosticism, not in the absolute sense, but there's a kind of agnosticism in this sense, that I can't fully and comprehensively know God. He transcends my knowledge. He transcends my experience. And so in Jesus, in Christ, God comes to us and shows us things that transcend the power of the human mind to discover. God shows us His great love through Christ. Of course, Plotinus doesn't have that, and so for him, this is a journey of the intellect that can theoretically be completed in this life. It leads to a kind of elitism of the philosopher. So the philosopher is the one that's capable of achieving this type of mysticism. Whereas in Christian theology, it may be that the most ignorant of people, so far as philosophical knowledge are concerned, might be the ones who love God most deeply. And therefore it is not an intellectual elitism as we might see Plotinus' thought developing into, as Augustine will accuse it of that particular problem later on. In any case, those are a few thoughts about Plotinus and his philosophical contributions.